Okay, so getting right back to the rest of this unit, we're talking about microorganisms of disease, and we're talking about bacteria as an infectious agent. Now, we all know bacteria can cause infections, but how do they cause infections? Well, in order for a bacterial cell to cause an infection, it needs to stick onto a substrate or a surface. And some of the things that help them do that, if we think back about earlier when we were talking about bacterial structure, is we have the structures called pili. And those are little tiny extensions that stick out of the cell wall and through the capsule. And those pili are going to help them stick to different surfaces. Now, another thing they have are these compounds, or generally proteins. We call them adhesins. Um, it's pretty close to the word adhesion. That doesn't do much good, but adhesion. Um, what adhesion means is to stick, and that's exactly what these proteins do. They allow the bacteria to stick on a surface and recognize materials. Um, so these adhesins are going to help the bacteria stick onto the epithelial linings, skin. It's going to help them make a contact and stick to a place, and that's when they stick to a surface. That's when they can cause infection. And if you look at the picture there on the side, it's a pretty nasty infection called gangrenous stomatitis. It's a bacterial infection. In this case, the poor guy's got it in his cheek, and I think actually the bacteria has um, infected the mucosa, and it's caused ulcerative necrosis. So necrosis means death of the tissue, and it looks like you can actually see in through his cheek into the buccal cavity. So that's a pretty serious infection. Now, there's another few things that bacteria have that will help them um, cause an infection. A couple of these are enzymes. So again, if you look at this word and you see A's at the end, that generally tells you that you're looking at an enzyme. Um, hyaluronidase, this is an enzyme that helps the bacteria break down the materials between cells. So if you think of your epithelial cells, these tissues, they got a nucleus, some of them got cilia, and they live really close together like this. Again, if we have the enzyme hyaluronidase, it's going to be able to move into this area right here and separate these cells. When these cells move apart, that allows bacteria to leak inside and get deeper into the tissues. So hyaluronidase is an enzyme that will allow tissue penetration. This is something that will help bacteria cause an infection, and it's something that makes them more virulent, or the ability to them to cause greater infection or bigger disease. Once the bacteria gets inside the tissue, it can secrete an enzyme called coagulase. Now, what coagulase does is it clots blood cells. So the bacteria can have their cells, and they'll secrete the enzyme coagulase, and what will happen is red blood cells that are around the cells will stick together, and they'll basically form a shield around all those bacterial cells. So the white blood cells, which are on the outside, and the white blood cells have all kinds of interesting nuclei, they won't be able to penetrate this shield to fight against the bacteria, which will allow those bacteria to keep multiplying and growing in numbers, and eventually they can also produce an enzyme that will break this clot and allow those cells to leak out and cause further infection. So these two enzymes allow bacteria to make once they've attached, to penetrate tissues and then to fool the immune system and allows them time to create a bigger infection. Bacteria can also secrete toxins into host tissues, and this can, if the toxins build up to a big level, it can secrete a massive or stimulate a massive immune response. So in this case, the toxins are released, the host's immune response so pronounced or so big that it can actually kill the host. So these toxins can be quite dangerous. And if we look at disease in humans overall, 50% of these human diseases are caused by eubacteria, and those are true bacteria. So it's a pretty significant infectious agent. One of the things that happens when these bacteria secrete toxins is we produce interferon and other compounds called pyrinogens, and this causes a fever. And what a fever's response is, or what a fever's goal is to increase the temperature in your body, and that increase in temperature will it'll increase your metabolism for one thing. It'll increase the functionality of your immune system, but hopefully it'll also override the metabolism of a bacteria. Maybe even get warm enough to denature some of their enzymes to slow down their metabolism. So that's a fever, and that's a general response to an infectious agent, not just bacteria. All right. Another example of bacteria as a infectious agent is a mycoplasma. And one of the most common ones of these are Mycoplasma pneumoniae. And this bacteria, as its name suggests, will cause pneumonia. This type of bacteria doesn't have that typical cell wall, so it doesn't stain gram-negative or gram-positive. It has that mycolic acid, so this would be a bacteria that we talked about earlier. That would be an acid-fast bacteria. So not gram-positive, not gram-negative, not a typical cell wall. What makes those so effective is that most of our antibiotics that we use are aimed at the cell wall. So right off the bat, we don't have a lot of antibiotics that can help us with one of these infections. Most of these species are harmless, but we do have a couple that can cause infections. You can have this one, Mycoplasma genitalium, which causes infections in the genitals, and more commonly you'd get Mycoplasma pneumoniae, which causes a disease called walking pneumonia. That's a term that doctors will usually call it atypical. And that means not irregular pneumonia. It's generally a little bit of a easier going or not quite as bad pneumonia. You probably won't. You could actually have this and not feel terribly sick, but you'd still be able to spread it, and you'd still have an infection in your lungs. We can see some other different types of bacteria. Chlamydia trachomatis. These are obligate intracellular parasites. They're transmitted by direct sexual contact, and chlamydia is a very common sexually transmitted infection. And you'll often see those STI, and formerly we used to call them STD for sexually transmitted diseases. Generally, this is the new condition that we'll use. It's quite easily transmitted. It can be passed during childbirth from the mother to the newborn, and that's what we call vertical. Oh, sorry, no, forget that. That's not true. The disease that it causes is pelvic inflammation in females, and if you have this disease for a long time and it's untreated, it can be as severe and it can lead to sterility, which obviously means you won't be able to have any children. And this disease is unique to humans. It doesn't happen in any other animals. Another bacteria that's an infectious agent is a species called rickettsii, and this is causes a disease called Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So the bacteria will cause fever, headaches, a rash, which of course is where you get the spotted fever, nausea, and vomiting. And this can be a lethal condition if it's not treated. It's caused by an obligate intracellular parasite, the Rickettsia species of bacteria. It's transmitted via arthropods, so fleas, ticks, and lice. So these arthropods can, when they bite, they can release the bacteria into your circulatory system. They'll find cells to colonize to cause infection, and this is what will lead to the fever. These are obligate intracellular parasites, so they have to live in between our cells. That's the only place that they can live happily, in the cells of the arthropod, the vector, and then in our cells where they cause disease. And I guess the infectious agent of the day is going to be our viruses, and you guys have had a pretty good education with viruses if you've watched any of the news recently. We all know that these are tiny, tiny microorganisms. We know that they're not living. They need to have a living cell in order to reproduce. All viruses are pathogenic. Pathogenic means that they cause disease. So all viruses are pathogenic. They can cause a range of infections. Of course, the big one that we're worried about right now is SARS-CoV-2, and that causes the disease COVID-19. You guys know antibiotics have no effect, and other examples of viruses, are the cold, influenza, measles, polio, AIDS, influenza, Ebola. All of these are caused by viruses. There are many, many others you could list as well. Okay, if you think back to the lab now, we're switched from viruses, we're talking about protozoans. So of course these are going to be eukaryotic cells now, so these are going to be much, much more difficult for us to fight. And some of the examples of these are going to be, amoebas, paramecium, the cryptosporidium that we looked at in the lab. All of these are going to be examples of parasitic or infectious agents of protists. Also, you can remember in the lab we looked at Giardia. Those are the little ones that look like they had a smiling face, but they caused some pretty bad diarrhea. And another word for Giardia, common where I come from, is called beaver fever. Generally, when we think of fungi as an infective agent, we think of them as first we think of them as beneficial. Many of these are very, very economically important, especially when we consider yeast. So, penicillin led to an antibiotic, but can also be used in food. Truffles, mushrooms, morels, yeast and fungi are used to produce bread and alcohol. So generally, we think of these as a beneficial organism. Not only that, in their ecological role as a decomposer, they are very, very important, very, very efficient. These guys are absorptive heterotrophs, so they're going to grow on their food source. They're going to secrete the enzymes, leak out of their cells onto their food source. Enzymes will digest the material, and then they'll absorb the materials that they need. So they're a very interesting type of nutrition. They can, however, cause several diseases in humans. Plant and animal sickness, athlete's foot, rust, candidiasis, which is yeast infections, and so on and so forth. One of the things that's key about about fungi is they can produce toxins. So aflatoxins, for example, they'll grow on peanuts, cotton. These are really carcinogenic compounds, so that means they can produce cancer. So we have to be very careful when we're storing grains and stuff because of these aflatoxins. Another chemical that can be created by fungi is ergot, and this is an alkaloidal compound, and it grows on cereals and rye, and it can cause gangrene and convulsions. It's quite a serious toxin.